Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old, an anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, we are focusing today on the subject of death. Never a subject far from most of our minds. A couple of years ago, we did a show with my guest today, Charles Derber, very distinguished sociologist from Boston College, author of many different books, on how capitalism is driving extinction. His book back then was entitled Dying for Capitalism, How Big Money Fuels Extinction and What We Can Do About It. And Charles, who's the author of many books going back to The Pursuit of Attention back in 1979, has an intriguing new book out, once again about death, except this is a book about social death. Bonfire, American Sociocide, Broken Relations, and the Quest for Democracy. I'm thrilled that Charles Derber is still alive, at least. He's talking to us from his office in Brookline, Boston College. Charles, intriguing new book, Bonfire, and particularly intriguing is this term sociocide. I know it's a term that was invented by the Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung. I'm sure you knew him pretty well. Why did you choose to use this word, sociocide?
Well, I think it evokes, when people hear it, they probably think suicide. And we're talking about a kind of societal suicide. The book is making an argument that we're kind of breaking apart into individual, atomized individuals who have no sense of real enduring connection with each other. And the argument of the book is that this is being driven by powerful people in our society who are worried about solidarity and how it might threaten their rule. And it's driven by technology in part. Social media plays a role in the South Silicon Valley, which I know you're much interested in. And my argument in the book is that it has a devastating effect when societies commit suicide, unravel. It breaks down the possibility of sort of a normal, humane community and life, and opens the door to what we're facing today, which is an authoritarian sort of power, dictatorial kind of leader who capitalizes on the fear and isolation of people facing sociocide.
Yeah, we know that leader. We'll try to avoid his name as much as we can. He may come up later. You're a sociologist, Charles, as I noted earlier. You're all too familiar with the history of sociology. One of the most distinguished sociologists in the history of the discipline is the Frenchman Émile Durkheim, who, of course, wrote about suicide at the beginning of the 20th century. What's the connection in the history of sociology between Durkheim's notion of suicide and Galtung or your notion of sociocide? Are they parallel phenomena? Are they bound up together?
Oh, yes. Durkheim, who is one of the founders of sociology, he argued that individual suicide was a function of collective suicide, that the people who were most vulnerable individually to committing suicide were living under circumstances where their integration into a socially cohesive community or society was failing, and people were being spun into isolated, atomized units with very little connection to each other. And Durkheim said the function of that is that it unravels social connections and social integration, which I'm calling sociocide, which is in Durkheim, classic sociology's view, the underpinning of suicide in Durkheim's view, that individuals cannot, we're a social species. We survive and prosper when we are socially connected and tied to each other. And when we're living in a society like America, and I have a lot of data on this book, where more and more people are eating all their meals alone. I've seen data up that has up to 68% of people say they eat most of their meals alone. The numbers of people who claim to have close friends, the numbers of people who get married or stay married, the number of people who feel connected at their workplace to other workers or to their employers is all on a downward path. And this book is an effort to sort of explain why this is happening and how we can break this very dangerous trend, because it undermines really the possibility for happiness and for community, and it gives rise to what we're experiencing today, which is this terrifying rise of authoritarianism.
Charles, you've been in this game, so to speak, a long time. You went to jail for protesting the Vietnam War. You were schooled in the work of Marx and Marcuse in particular, the Frankfurt School. You're the son of the New Deal economist Milton Derber. Again, you don't need me to tell you any of this stuff. You have a close connection with Chomsky, perhaps the father figure, the man who is best known as the leftist critique of capitalism. My thoughts on your argument are, and I'm not sure what to think. On the one hand, guys like yourself and Adorno and Chomsky and all the rest of them have been warning about this now for 60 years. So on the one hand, there's a logic to it. On the other hand, you've been warning about it for 60 years and it never seems to happen. And we get the same warnings. We're getting it now with Trump. We got it with Reagan. We got it during Vietnam. We got it during the period of neoliberalism. Do you see my point? That you are, in a sense, you're not a boy, but the man who called wolf. But on the other hand, a lot of your arguments do, in my view at least, make sense. So untangle that one for me.
Yeah, well, I think authoritarianism itself, I'm writing a couple of new books on authoritarianism, and one is on the Constitution and sort of traces, the elements of authoritarianism back in America right to the beginning of the country and to the Constitution. And the sort of hyper individualistic culture and the sort of capitalist elements that give rise to these problems is not new. They're just emerging in a new and more scary form right now, in my view. I wrote a book about 10 years ago, Andrew, called Sociopathic Society, which argued that societies can contradictorily
and the subtitle of the book is A People's Sociology of the United States, very much like, and I'm sure he's another old friend of yours, or was an old friend, Howard Zinn's People's History.
Yes, you're right. And the idea of that book was that we're living in a society which has values which are antisocial. And, I trace that to the rise of corporate power and control over the culture that economic power usually brings, in which people, the elites who have a lot of money and a lot of power in our society, I trace this back to the robber barons of the Gilded Age, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and so forth, have always tried to basically keep people relatively isolated from each other. Now, this, by the way, it's not exactly a classic idea of Marxism, because, Marx saw a saving grace in capitalism was that it moved people into one of the virtues of capitalism, in relation to prior forms of the economic order, was that people used to sort of work in their homes or in their farms, and they were not necessarily tightly connected in their work. And capitalism brought people together in social workplaces where they could get to know each other in and through their work and build some kind of community and solidarity at work. So that I believe that permitted some form of continuing relationship that was sociopathic in its character, in the sense it was built on relations of exploitation, but it allowed people to maintain a continuing relationship with each other. What's new, in my view, Andrew, is that these sociopathic kinds of values, yes, they've been around and they've created forms of, I don't think we've ever had a deeply democratic society. I think there's a great deal of myth about that, based in this idea that capitalism, because, Milton Friedman says, capitalism is inevitably the freest society because the free market guarantees freedom. And yes, I've long critiqued that argument, and you're right that I've also long argued that American capitalism has a distinctively anti-collective, anti-state kind of, or at least anti-social welfare state kind of system, which breeds isolation and individualism and, the lack of a sense of collective we and so forth. But I think now, and this is a little bit up your alley, that the way in which our new robber barons, who include our Silicon Valley trillionaires, to these magnificent 7 companies, and the social media and the logarithmic wiring of power that's coming out of, our new robber barons, is kind of intensifying this breakdown of connection with each other. And these new elites, economic elites, robber barons always had a lot of power. We've always had, you're right, I spent my life writing about corporate oligarchy, but it keeps taking new forms. And this kind of, I think that this sociopathic individualism, anti-collective, anti-social thing is sort of evolving into, I don't think it was tearing society completely apart. It preserved an exploitative society. I think what we're facing now, we're not there yet, but a real sociocide means literally societal suicide, the literal breaking apart of society. You might, if you look at the book, I start at the very beginning of the book talking about the Ik, a mountain people tribe described by the anthropologist Colin Turnbull, which he called a loveless society. If you and I had lived in this society, Andrew, and you were sick, and I lived in your family, if I tried to go out and bring you food because you were hungry and needed it, or you were sick, I would die, because I was so hungry that I had to be focused on myself. Everybody in that society, the anthropologist found, had to be laser focused on filling their own stomach, on focusing on themselves. And if they were trying to sort of express or develop some sort of concern and care for others, they would die. He called this the loveless society. I think our market system in the current age is producing a kind of analog of that today, in which people are becoming more, I collect a lot of data in the book that people are so much more isolated than they have been. They eat more meals. Some data shows 68% of people eat most of their meals alone. I already cited some of these other data, but what I didn't realize until I started researching this book was how I'd always thought it was the more individualistic, upper middle class people, highly educated people like myself, who were more vulnerable to this individualistic culture. But new surveys have shown that actually the people who live in civic deserts, which I described, were places where there aren't public spaces, cafes, public gardens, museums, parks, places where people can gather and sit and come to know each other. The civic deserts are experienced in the working classes, the people who are experiencing a great deal of economic insecurity at the same time that their social connections are being
and this is a theme we've explored in the show several times, particularly in a new book on exerbia. It's interesting that you bring up the L word, Charles, love. I'm sure you're familiar with the work, the sociological, anthropological, philosophical work of the Italian thinker Silvia Federici, who focuses on love. Is this what, your thesis is complicated, but if we're to boil it all down, is sociocide triggered by the absence of love? Is that why the work of Federici and others, particularly feminists, it might be relevant, particularly in terms of a cure to all this?
Well, I mean,
Are you familiar?
Sociocide,
I'm sure you're familiar with Federici's work.
I don't know her work well, no. But love is an important idea in the book. And I mean, I remember I told you that the ick that the book starts with, and the Colin Turnbull described it as the loveless society.
Yeah, and your first chapter is entitled "The Bonfire of Social Relations and Democracy: The Self-Destructing Society, Tipping Points of Social Connection, and the Path to Sociocide and what you call policide."
Yes, and you know your reference to feminism is interesting in the sense that feminism did teach us that the personal, political and personal are intertwined. You know, the old famous sociologist C. Wright Mills says that you can't understand public issues without understanding private troubles. And that this book, I think, offers, the reason I think that people might find this book interesting is that I try to connect the deepest structural, economic, and political problems that we're facing with very personal, emotional issues that are front and center in our actual personal lives. And I think, you know, you're right that I've written books like The Pursuit of Attention that look at the culture of narcissism. I know an issue that you've discussed and thought about. And it's not new, but I think there's a new interface between personal psychological crisis rooted in an absence of love and an inability, you know, people lacking the emotional reserves and space to build love. And but I don't say this is the cause of society.
Right, and of course we have the rise of suicide, particularly amongst young people. This term sociocide, Charles, does it manifest agency? Does it reflect the action, if not of individuals, of the society to commit suicide? I mean, suicide doesn't just happen. You don't commit suicide in a matter of forgetfulness. You actually have to make the decision. So
yes,
there are lots of moral arguments about suicide. One in favor, I guess, is it manifests a degree of human agency. They've chosen to end their life. Do, in your view, when it comes to sociocide, particularly contemporary America, in your argument at least, have Americans somehow collectively, implicitly or otherwise, decided to destroy their own society?
I mean, only in the sense that they've acclimated to the reign or the sort of perpetuation of a system which concentrates enormous economic capital and social capital. I just want to use the term social capital, which I'm sure you know, but maybe many of your audience does not. You know, another French writer named Pierre Bourdieu argued that social capital is as central as economic capital in our lives and in society. And social capital is the kind of capacity for power and meaning and connection that grows out of relations between people. And when social capital declines, just like when economic capital declines, you're in deep trouble. You're in a really bad place. So Americans have been living in a system that, when you say, who are the agents, who are the architects of the death of social capital, they're the same people who are essentially redistributing wealth upwards, as we saw in the mega bill that we talked about just before I came on, where money is being redistributed, financial capital, overwhelmingly from ordinary people to people at the very top.
Right, but and yet, Charles, when it comes to this issue of agency and sociocide, are we all, and particularly Americans, are they the proverbial frogs in the pot of boiling water? Because whether you like it or not, and many people on the left are very uncomfortable, but it is a fact that more and more poor Americans are voting for Trump. They seem to be voting, at least in the minds of people, progressives, people on the left, they seem to be voting against their own interest or to borrow your language in Sociocide, they're voting for their own death.
Yes. Well, the book has a lot of focus on exactly that issue. I mean, the people with the lowest integration into society have the lowest relationships, eat more alone, have fewer friends. All the Trump base is, at least according to the data that I've been able to collect, is the part of America most characterized by sociocide. So why are they supporting Trump? Well, it's sort of like a cult phenomenon in a way. They're alone. They feel scared economically. Most of them say they're one paycheck away from poverty. They don't have a really robust network of family and friends that they feel they can depend on. If they get sick or they lose a job, they lose their job, they're done. The social safety net is gone. So, I don't think those people are choosing either sociocide. They want connections. I think we're wired to want connections, but they're living in a society that's made it very difficult to achieve those connections, and both to achieve the capital you need to actually financially to actually survive, and the social capital you need to actually connect with people and build a meaningful community and to build love. And so are you saying, if you say, well, why are these working people who are supporting Trump, why are they supporting Trump? One, they're scared and they don't see where they have other, people who are afraid and isolated. Hannah Arendt, de Tocqueville, many great thinkers have recognized that isolation and atomization is a foundation for authoritarianism and strong leaders who capitalize on the fear and disconnection of people. When people are isolated, they look to strong leaders who will protect them. And particularly when they're being told that they're facing enemies who are out to destroy them, as authoritarian leaders like Trump, right-wing populist leaders have always done. So I think it's really, not an accurate diagnosis at all to say people are choosing suicide. But it is true to say that people are living in a society which is not giving people a lot of good choices. If people had not chosen Trump, they would have gotten Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris was part of a Democratic Party that had embraced the status quo. Well, Trump was seen overwhelmingly, and it was true, as the change candidate. If you're unhappy with your life, things are not going well, either socially or economically, you want big change. Trump promised it, and he's delivering it. Kamala Harris and the Democrats were promising the status quo. They were not really challenging. They were arguing that the Biden years had just really solved most of the problems. They would kick in and people would be well. They had moved from any awareness of the social and economic, the collapse of economic and social capital, to a defense of it, and saying that the real politics we need to do are simply focus on siloed identity groups, race, gender, obviously very important issues in America, but now providing a basis, the foundation of the Democratic Party, which has absolutely no way of responding. What does identity politics do? It takes people who are already splintered and divided and forces them to compete with other identity groups. Blacks have to compete with Asians, who have to compete with, immigrants. It just opens the door to a kind of splintered, divisive, sort of far-right version of politics and populism, which Trump exploited. Did people choose to die? No. They just felt that they were making the best choice available to them, which was a guy who was promising to bring them together, to bring jobs back home, and unite them around some sort of Christian religious, community.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a Jim Jones quality to
yes,
Trumpianism. There was an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal about people like Elizabeth Warren, who have warned people that people will die in Trump's new bill if it's voted in. But the journal notes that people aren't really particularly impacted by that. To quote the journal, it isn't the policy clincher it seems. In other words, there is a kind of weird cult of death about all this, isn't there?
Well, I think the analogy of cults is very relevant. I have a friend, Steve Hassan, who has written a book called The Cult of Trump. And, in the book, I do discuss the parallels between what we're dealing with in the larger society and the rise of cults and the fact that Trump has a lot of characteristics of a cult leader. And you're right, there's a death quality. People are willing to die for the leader. So it's an apt analogy. At the same time, I feel like, people sort of say, well, then these people are just crazy or choosing, there's something mentally disturbed about them, or they're succumbing to irrational
Right. It's
culture
the
wars.
or the it's the
But they,
the
they made
liberal the Hillary Clinton critique of
right,
them being what did she call them?
the deplorables. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, the book does a lot of, pushing back on that. I mean, I think it's not even pushing back on Thomas Frank's idea that the Democratic Party has to be more populist. I have a share of that view.
Yeah, and Frank's been on the show. Of course, he's the author, perhaps most famously, of what is it? What's the matter with Kansas?
What's the matter with Kansas? Yeah, and I think that's right. But I think the idea that voting for your culture is not completely crazy. I mean, the working class people were not getting an economic choice. It's Bush and Bush light. It's been that way for many years. Trump actually looked like he was going to do a little bit more to try to bring manufacturing jobs home. And at the same time, he was saying, look, the left is offering you a cultural thing that makes you, sort of bow down to the gods of racism and sexism and watch your language and so forth. And, he was right about that. I'm a left guy, but I think there's always been an orthodoxy and political culture of correctness on the left. I've been in enough left movements, as you suggested, to know how toxic that can be. So
you mentioned Tocqueville and Arendt, and when I was thinking about your book and your argument, Charles, it occurred to me that Arendt's great work, perhaps her greatest work from the early 50s, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she's basically saying the same thing as you in the sense that totalitarianism or authoritarianism is rooted in broken relations. But is the difference between Arendt's argument in The Origins of Totalitarianism and your argument is that for Arendt, this was imposed from above. For you, it's a bit more complicated.
Well, I'll just say that Arendt remains incredibly relevant today. She wrote after, during and after European fascism.
And not a woman of the left. I mean, she had very uncomfortable relations with the Frankfurt School. She wasn't really a traditional leftist, was she?
You're right. But, she aligns with this book in that she says loneliness is one of the core social psychological foundations of totalitarianism. She really highlights that. I encourage people to read this. I discuss it in my book. But in terms of your argument that, she says it comes from the top. I'm arguing over and over again in this book, Andrew, that this is not people choosing to die. This is people trying to survive in a system that's giving them very bad choices. And where they're already in, if you go back to the ick kind of IK, the loveless people, those people were not evil. They just didn't have a choice if they were going to survive. The options open to them. The options that, our economic and political system has left available to most working Americans are terrible. They don't have good choices. And Trump looked like a pretty good choice. And until there is a better alternative emerging in the Democratic Party, I'm not going to be surprised that a lot of the Trump base stands with Trump. I think it's a horrifying decision because for many different reasons, I don't think we're likely to survive. And this goes back to the crises that we talked about in my last book. Trump is, one of the big things about this bill that we're not talking about the budget bill.
Yeah, I want to get to your argument about what we need to deal with this, Charles. But why is Trump then? And why are the people around Trump doing this? What's your explanation? In contrast, say, with Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, they're not really traditionally fascist or communist. They don't have a grand view of history. They're self-interested. But why are they doing it?
Well, I think, if you look at the bill, which since we're talking a day after, budget's bill, what did that budget bill do, Andrew? I mean, it's the most wholesale delivery of what corporate elites have been looking for over the last, 150 years. I mean, it's a rejection. It's the biggest redistribution upward from the poor to the rich of wealth in American history. It's what the Republicans for years have been trying to savage Medicaid, Medicare, social government by its very nature, the whole idea of a collectivity. So I just see this as an absolute perpetuation of classic, traditional, Republican, anti-government, oligarchic kind of politics. But now sort of more completely, sort of enveloped in a sort of Christian nationalist, sort of populist appeal to workers. It's the first time, I mean, we have a long history of Christian evangelical nationalism and on the right. But this is the first time that we have a party completely committed to that, since the Confederacy, I'd say, committed to that, which is fundamentally totally aligned. It's so ironic and paradoxical. It's delivering what the corporate oligarchy has always wanted. It's just been signed by Trump, yesterday. It's what they've always wanted. I'm surprised that you're asking why they want it. They've wanted it forever. This is exactly what they've wanted.
Well, but do they? I mean, if they're rational, if it really is what you argue is a sociocide and the country is about to disintegrate, then a bonfire. I mean, you've got a violent image on the cover of your book of a huge fire. Do they really want that?
Well, I think that they want people to be fearful and they don't want any kind of solidarity other than one that is aligning with the great leader that we're not naming. I mean, this is the goal of an oligarchy. It's the economic vision of the oligarchy since the Gilded Age, combined with the kind of authoritarian, it's sort of the unmasking of the latent authoritarianism that's been building in America since the foundation. I've got a new book coming out called Wired for Authoritarianism, which shows how the Constitution sort of laid the legal and political foundations for this at the founding of the country.
Well, that sounds, we'll have to, when's the book out, Charles?
That'll probably be out in about, you would like this, I think, Andrew.
Yeah, well, we'll have to get you back on the show. So finally, what are we going to do about it? You're no great friend, as you've made clear, of Kamala Harris and Bidenomics and the centrist Democratic Party, who are conservatives but won't acknowledge it. Is all this just an argument for AOC or Bernie, or do you have a grander vision?
Well, I find some hope here. I mean, it sounds like a grim analysis, the end of love, the end of, loneliness, despair. But, as I've watched the various forms of opposition and resistance, as we've seen Trump move faster than I think most of us thought toward a more authoritarian thing, I never, for example, thought that Sociocide would permit ordinary Americans to identify so strongly with the immigrants who are being rounded up and sort of, deprived of basic rights and, sent into Salvadoran torture prisons and so forth. I mean, to me, that's a sign that Sociocide has not completely won. I've always been a believer in contradiction. The very forces that give rise to Sociocide also help. I think, for example, you do think about a lot, social media, the internet age, and so forth. These are incredibly threatening things, and they give complete cultural and political support for tyranny and authoritarianism. And at the same time, they build certain kinds of potentials for people coming together in new ways. I believe that, the amount of, with the No Kings protest that happened a couple of weeks ago, the protest.
Yeah, we've done some shows on No Kings. A lot of people were encouraged by that day.
Yeah, I did not expect that there would be this much resistance this quickly. And the fact that people now are, the answer to Sociocide is coming together. It's fun to come together. If you're alone, isolated, people are finding each other on the streets. And, any real success is getting people out on the streets and wherever, in town halls and workplaces, and to not just once, but over and over again. What will bring them back over and over again is partly the pleasures, and the sort of, in 2011 in Egypt, the Arab Spring, students came out in masses and they failed.
But you're
because the
right.
protest didn't run.
That's my final question, Charles. You're a veteran of protest movements. As I said, you were put in jail for protesting Vietnam. You were around the Occupy movement as well. It's all very well showing up for No Kings. It's one big day, one big demonstration, then we go back to our regular lives. What have you learned from your life of being involved with one kind of protest or another, from the 60s, from the Occupy movement, about how to more effectively protest to achieve long-lasting structural change? Because if you note in Bonfire, this isn't just about some annoying person like Trump who's come along. This has long, deeply rooted structural
absolutely
reasons for its existence. So what do we learn from the 60s and from Occupy that we can begin to build more effective resistance movements?
Well, you need a vision of what's wrong, and so I think sort of having a political party or simply local organizations, communities that are talking about what's wrong and how did we get into this situation where we're all vulnerable to this kind of despair and isolation and lovelessness that we're talking about. An analysis, education is super important. That's why young people have an important role, whether they're in schools, whatever, they're more open to thinking in new ways about these problems. So education is a big part of it. And, just coming together, what I like about protest, whether it's on the streets or in workplaces or campus, is that it brings us together. And, in a joyful way often. Even Kamala Harris was able to bring both online and offline, bring people together for at least temporary periods of, sort of hope and possibility. And that's the secret, is persevering in this coming together, because it's the only way we solve the crises of personal unhappiness and despair that we're dealing with. And we're really in an emergency situation, in my view. We politically emergency. Hitler moved very rapidly. In 6 months, he had destroyed the opposition, in almost every way. The Enabling Act in 2 months had basically destroyed the legislature and the possibility of opposition. We have a little more time. I think, what I've learned is that people have to persevere in public protest together. You have to come together. People are scared. Everybody I know is scared. My students are scared. My colleagues are scared. People who write are scared. Probably people who do your kind of broadcasting. We know many people in the media are vulnerable to being arrested and deported. Academic friends who are writing about tyranny, who I'm sure you talk to, like Tim Snyder or other people like that, they're moving to Canada. So how do you combat that kind of fear? I think it's only by trying to build in every phase of your life these connections that give you a sense of hope and caring and possibility. And that sounds kind of utopian and sort of these are just people out making. I remember that when Vivian Gornick, you probably know this book, The Romance of American Communism, she wrote about how in the 30s, the left came together. It had an awful lot of mistakes, but it built this kind of, activists got married to each other. They had kids. They sent their kids to summer camps. They had red diaper babies. They created songs. Pete Seeger and the Weavers, they built a kind of culture which endured. And, Pete Seeger went from the labor struggles of the 30s to the 60s movements. I think that's how people win. They build these enduring intergenerational movements that have the kind of social foundations and the political vision that go way beyond our current Bush and Bush-light kind of politics toward a real change in the way our society is.
Well, there we have it. Charles Derber, always an honor. Pleasure to have you on the show. Your new book, Bonfire, American Sociocide, Broken Relations and the Quest for Democracy, brings a lot of the themes in your long history as a sociologist, or bring it all together. You are, I think, in your own way, a manifestation of your argument about enthusiasm, energy, positiveness, even love. So, Charles, love to have you back on the show when your American book comes out. Sounds really good.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege.